Welcome back to Inside the Pastor Study Podcast. My name is Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
And we are a father-son pastoral team serving north of Boston, Methuen, Massachusetts. And our goal with this podcast is to come and give you a look into what happens throughout the week. How do pastors interact with each other? What are some of the conversations they have? And what are some of the things that we think about outside of the normal, like Sunday morning services and Bible studies and things like that? What are the things that we tend to wrestle with and wonder about throughout the week? A lot of those are biblically based and theological, and sometimes they're just cultural, and sometimes they're just fun and interesting to us. We both love trivial type things. We were laughing earlier today in the office. We were talking about movie trivia between Sound of Music and My Fair Lady and the overlaps on those. It's random stuff that tends to happen here. But
see, I thought you were going to go on the hymnal thing.
Yeah,
that was crazy. Yeah,
we reintroduced a hymn from the late 1800s last night in a worship time, and I have a hymnal collection, and I was digging through those, and the hymn doesn't exist in any of those.
Not in any one.
A bunch of them. So that was kind of a fun little diversion. So we do all kinds of random things here, but our goal here is to be able to dig into some topics that perhaps you've wondered about, and you're curious about what a pastor's opinion is on those. And so that's what we do in the podcast. You may also now beginning this week, we're going to be wrestling with this and figuring it out a bit. So there'll be some fits and starts and different things here, but you have the chance to watch us in the studio too.
Is that what he looks like?
Yeah.
Oh,
man, that's the guy. All right. He has way less hair than I thought he would. And his son does too. All right. Yeah. So you have a chance to watch us on YouTube. We'll be showing these now. So if you're the kind of person who would rather watch the episode than listen to it, we're beginning to make those available. So
but please don't drive while watching the episode.
Not a good idea. No. Not a good idea. So that is coming. We're playing with it this episode. We're going to work on refining that a bit, and it'll be a piece of what we offer here coming into the future. Sometimes those are just easier to share. Sometimes it's easier to share a YouTube video than it is a podcast. We have that conversation. A lot of people don't even know what a podcast is, but most people understand what a YouTube video is. And so if there's something that's easy to share with a friend, that might be the better option. But today we want to dig into some interesting topics. I'm looking forward to these conversations. And we begin with our theological term of the week. All right, so here it is. Theological term of the week is
holiness.
Holiness. All right. So we were chatting about this before we got started. Some of these
we have to keep this short.
I know. I'm looking back at some of the ones we've hit, and we have some that are kind of self-explanatory and easy, and then we have some of these other conversations that could go all day long. And I think holiness is in the all day long category.
It is, because there's just so much. I think there's so much that we've attached to it, but there's so many depth issues with holiness. And remember, we've talked about these are mutable attributes or characteristics of God. So that means that there are things that you and I and every human being in the world has.
That's an interesting track here, because I'm thinking about this in terms of just like spiritual holiness.
Yes.
Right. So we have God's holiness, and we're Christians. We love Jesus. We have the Holy Spirit. So we have the opportunity for holiness.
Yes.
I didn't really think about this as far as like all of mankind elements of holiness.
Exactly. Right. Which, I just, a step into the political, right? We talk about in the United States, we have first 10 amendments to the Constitution that identify that there are concepts like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the freedom to and the right to own and bear firearms, the ability to keep my home as my home and not have to quarter the military of the world. What's interesting is that that's also called the Bill of Rights in the United States. And the Bill of Rights, we attest and identify that those are rights that are given to us by God, not rights that are given to us by our government. So therefore, if there are rights given to us by God, it's not just rights given to us as Americans, but it's rights actually given to everybody in the whole world. And that's this concept that we have with mutability, is that these aren't things that we're just talking about being given to Christians. We're talking about We're talking about every human being in this world understands what holiness is, and every human being in this world acts, whether he realizes it or not, within the concept of holiness.
Okay, so now is that point, I think, where we should spend some time defining this, because I'm really curious about how that teases out there.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? All right, so here's some things we have to freight into the word holiness. The word holy is a Hebrew word that means to be set apart or distinctive or separate.
Mm-hmm.
So I begin that understanding of set apart, distinct, and separate, and I understand that God, in his transcendency, is set apart, distinct, and separate. And every human being understands that God is set apart, distinct, separate. You even go back to Greek mythology or Babylonian mythology or even Asian, Hindu. You can take Hindu, Buddhism, whatever theology you want to take. Their gods are separate.
Mm-hmm.
There's a distinctiveness to them. Whether that's the Greeks who just identify some power, some authority, some way in which their gods, in their humanity and in their organization from chaos, are different. They still, as gods, are holy. They're different.
Right. Yeah, they still get to live on Olympus.
Exactly. So one of the first steps to grasping holiness and understanding holiness and its attributes of God, but also its mutability to human beings, we understand that there's difference. We understand that there's distinction. We understand that there's a separation that exists between God and man. And then we reflect that separation as well. And we're probably going to spend more time talking about holiness as it affects us, I guess, than we are holiness as it affects God.
I feel like, yeah, if you're tuning into the podcast, you have at least some baseline understanding of Christianity, right? And I think even if you don't have a baseline understanding,
although we have that guy in India who listens to us.
We've seen that.
And I don't know.
It's pretty cool. So, this basic, I think most of us have a basic understanding of how religion works, right?
Yeah.
So you could be agnostic or an atheist tuning into this, and you'd at least know that as a religious person, I would expect my deity to be separate in some level from me.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So that I think we can kind of hold on to that and figure that part out, that God is separate and unique, and he does not have, he has this set apartness from humanity. He's not just a better one of us. He is his own, which I think there's some controversies on that, right? Like God is not just a better human, like God is God.
Yes.
Right. So there's history on that too. But, see, we told you this could go a long way, this conversation.
Crazy.
So, but like, all right, so let's
and
make that
you wanted to time cap this.
I know. All right, so let's make that a given that God is holy and set apart. So as Christians, we can be holy and we can make things holy unto God.
Yes. Right.
And then we also would say that universally humans can understand holiness, act in holiness, value holiness, and ascribe holiness to certain things.
Sure, absolutely.
Because we all, as humans, we understand have this.
We understand that there are some things that are separate, and we understand our separateness. We tend to come back to environmentalism as a conversation because
it's a cultural norm at the moment, right?
It's more than that. It's more than a cultural norm. I would even venture to say, and I have friends who have been members of the Sierra Club since the 60s, okay? I would venture to say that environmentalism has become a religion. It's a pantheistic religion as practiced by many people, in that environmentalism sees the holiness of the created universe and the wholeness of it, the working together of it, is very actually Eastern Asian, even Hindu in its understanding of its wholeness of the earth. But within that, mankind still is expressing this concept of holiness, because how do we return the world to this environmental foundation and standard of perfection?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's all man's work.
Mm-hmm.
Human beings see themselves as the ones who are responsible for the destruction of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
How do we solve that? Do we let the planet solve it for itself? If the planet is God, if the environment is God, then the environment should be able to heal itself.
Mm.
It should be able to overcome the things that have been introduced into it. Instead, what we have is we have mankind, again, grasping their holiness, grasping the reality of their viceroy position in this world, and saying, I must change my environment. I must change my climate.
Because I am God.
Because I am God.
I can make things holy unto me.
Because we pervert holiness.
Right. And then I need to make sure this space is set apart to me and passed on to my progeny, my generations beyond me.
Because the standard of perfection and the standard of being set apart is being set apart for human use.
Right.
Not, yeah.
So, which again comes back, a lot of these, I feel like your mutability passage is the beginning of Romans, right? We talk about the difference between God's perfection and our imperfection, even though we are we're still his creation, and we're still as his image. We're made in his image. We aren't his image. And so we tend to pervert all of these things.
And then we ascribe.
And then we put the value that should go to him onto the things, right?
Yes.
Which is idolatry, which is the problem of the Old Testament, but it is our problem too. We make idols out of everything.
Therefore, the wrath of God abides upon all of us.
Right. Because we've made everything idols. And so what we've done with our holiness as humans is we've claimed ourselves to be the holy ones, whether we realize it or not. We're claiming ourselves as the holy ones, and then we're trying to make the things around us serve us.
Right. So here's where we take this next step, which, holiness also, the doctrine of holiness also has to contain the antithesis. So we're not only have to talk about holiness here, but here's where we also need to talk about sin. So while we can talk about, for example, when we get to goodness, we will talk about morality.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the issues of talking about holiness is that you have to have an absolute standard. So holiness means that there's something set apart. There's something distinctive. God is holy. He's distinctive. He's set apart. He's untouched. He's perfect. That becomes the standard, the holy standard by which we govern and by which we understand what right and wrong and good and bad are.
Yeah. So he's something ultimately holy.
So God is ultimately holy. Habakkuk puts it perfectly, right? When he says of God, his eyes are too pure to look upon sin. And that's not just that his eyes are too pure to countenance it and say, oh yeah, that's okay. It's all right. We'll change the standard. God's standard is my holiness is such that's not even something I want to look at.
Yeah.
I don't have any interest in that at all. So when we talk about holiness, we also have to introduce the doctrine of hamartology,
mm-hmm.
which, bonus word of the day, right? Hamartology is the study of sin.
I always think of it as harm, right?
Yes.
Hamartology,
yeah.
right? Sin.
Yeah.
So it's a good way to remember that. When was the last time you quoted Habakkuk? And if you're listening, when was the last time you heard Habakkuk quoted? That's a good one. I like that.
That's right.
Right. I was thinking about this in terms of opposites. So if holy means something that is totally set apart, and then we're phrasing sin as the opposite of holiness, and this is a future conversation also, this doctrine of sin. And digging into that. But I've always identified sin or defined sin as falling short of God's standard. But everything about holiness is something that is uniquely set apart and placed in this special position. Then would the opposite of holiness be common? Commonness.
Or, we have another word. We have another word that is part of our language, English language, that we don't use very often in this character, but the word vulgar is the meaning of common. It's everyday. It's
Right. We just tend to use that now for bad words.
And that's the key, because you see, a vulgar word is a word that's something uttered by somebody unholy or just strictly common and everyday.
Yeah.
So when we use vulgarities, we are lowering ourselves to the common, whereas God has called us to be holy.
Huh.
So that's one of those issues. That's why in many Christian circles the here we go, right? There's blasphemy,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is the usage of God's name in vain. Even Midwestern clean versions like Jeepers and Gosh.
The Ned Flanders lexicon, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Those are obscenity. Those are blasphemies,
Okay.
right? And then you have obscenity, which is the words that are just disgusting because they draw ugly pictures of normally good human life. And then you have vulgarity, which is words that are just earthy and common and shouldn't be part of a Christian's lexicon because he's holy.
Got it. Yeah. Okay.
Right? And all of those, the blasphemies, the obscenities, the vulgarities, they actually fall into the common realm. We shouldn't let those things be part of our language because they're common. They're other than holy.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, man, I'm pretty sure nobody tuning into this at the beginning of this conversation thought we were going to go to start talking about swear words. But yeah, right? And this is how this works.
But see, then even a swear word is a blasphemy, because you're actually, a blasphemy is you are taking God's name and you are proclaiming your truthfulness by your oath taking of in God's name, which is meaningless.
Yeah. See, there you go. There's why Christians shouldn't swear. I think like this is one of those things, right? Like I think a generational difference, a generational divide. I know a lot of Christians my age and younger who don't share the same kind of conscience.
Holiness?
That we'll call them older generations than mine, but we all know the slang. We know the invective at the moment, right? So boomers and older, right, would have a better understanding of this than I think younger generations, where we just tend to see this as like, that's just like this cultural thing. Like that's like our parents got mad about that, but really is it a big deal that I use these words? I mean, come on, they're just words.
Right.
Right.
But are they
holy?
Holy.
And are we speaking in holiness?
Am I convinced that what Jesus says in Matthew during the Sermon on the Mount, when he says God is holy, he says, "Be ye holy as your Father in heaven is holy." Is that just I'll never reach that. I'm not even going to try because I'll never reach that. So am I giving up on the objective before I even pursue it? But identifying that God's holiness mutes to every human being in this world, whether they are righteous or unrighteous. They have an understanding and a comprehension of their distinctiveness, their separation, and their purity standard that they could establish before God.
Yeah, and I think that is the challenge. I think for a lot of us as believers that we walk in holiness. This is throughout the New Testament. Motivated out of who Jesus was, and so we now have to try and figure out how to walk in holiness. And our constant challenge is between living as these people who are set apart versus living as people who are common to our culture and our surroundings. And we grow up thinking about holiness in terms of being good and following the rules. But I don't know that we often think about this in terms of, do I choose to live in a set-apart life that's dedicated to my Savior? Or do I choose to live a life that is common and looks just like the world I'm from? And that really is the distinction here, right?
Yeah. Can I be different?
Yeah.
And, here's the other side of this. Remember, holiness, every human being.
Mm-hmm.
Don't I then have the ability, the desire, and the focus of demanding that of everybody in the image of God.
Mm,
You do not have to be vulgar. You
right.
do not have to be common. I grew up, we've had this conversation. I grew up poor Irish kid in a good Irish neighborhood, and um, my mother would tell me that we were not low class Irish. This is what she actually. So some of you who are Irish, you grasp this. She would say, we're not some shanty Irishmen. She would, man, my mom, we were the other kind. She would insist that we were lace curtain Irish. And she would insist that we stay as above common as possible.
Mm.
I mean, all of my neighbors held their forks and spoons like shovels, and my mother would slap our hands for holding our spoon like a shovel. It had to be held properly because we're not shanty Irish, she would say. We're lace curtain Irish, and we are going to live our life like we're supposed to be.
Uh-huh.
And she made it different.
Yeah.
We were different, and I think that there's an element in Christianity. I don't care where you are. I don't care what you're. We should be encouraging people to be their best, to be separate, distinct.
Yeah. Because we all have that in us, whether we've decided to attribute it properly or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There you go. This theological term of the week, holiness. So we're talking about our main topic today. And we have a bunch of these lined up. There's different things that we've kind of wrestled with, like, oh, we should hold off on this conversation until we get to a podcast. And I preached last week. We've been doing in our church. We've been doing this year a series on communion during our communion weeks. So wherever we are in our sermon series, we will pause it on the first week of the month to do some kind of sermon on communion or an aspect of communion, and then we'll resume our normal programming, right?
Right.
And so we'll pause series in the middle, talk about communion on Communion Sundays, and then go back into other things. And so last week I was preaching on communion, Communion Sunday, and on communion, and the topic I was working through was this aspect of community and what does communion have to do with us as a church community, and the normal way that sermon goes is kind of the direction I took, that you approach the table making sure that you are in right relationship with the rest of the church body, and that if you're not in right relationship with the rest of the church body, let the elements pass, fix the relationship, and then together come back and serve at the table. And
like
remember,
spoon fix the relationship,
not just like put your elements back and be like, that person needs to come talk to me so I can take communion. I hope they know.
Yes.
I hope they know how offended I am with them. We are not in right relationship, and so I'm going to place my things back on the table so that they know that I am not in right relationship. And meanwhile, everybody else is looking at them.
I knew somebody that didn't take communion for like 5 years because they had an issue with somebody
who probably had no clue.
None.
Yeah, this is the way this stuff works.
Yeah.
You guys all know this, and we can all see that in other people. Hard to see it in ourselves.
Right.
So this was the conversation. This was the sermon. But here's the thing. Doing research, as I'm prone to do, and I like this kind of stuff, and digging into the whole conversation about communion, I came across some things that I had not come across before, and this has been messing with me a little bit ever since I came across this. So here's the thing: there is a series of early church writings that are compiled, called the Didache, and I referenced this in my sermon. One of the cool things that came out of that was during this communion supper, or this church supper, we'll call it for now. And part of one of the blessings that was prayed in the Didache was about how, as they were breaking the bread, they were reminded that the elements from the bread came from across the hills, and were baked into this one loaf that was now broken and shared among us as a community. And so now we are also unified in this same way. We come from all of these dispersed areas and dispersed time. We're all a different people And when we come to the table, we're reminded that we're all one in Jesus, right? It's a great picture.
Beautiful picture.
I loved it. I needed to I used that as an illustration in the sermon. But what I didn't talk about is how in that period of time during these church meals, which happened every Sunday evening, in that particular reference even, there's no blessing for the wine. There's only the blessing for the bread.
Interesting.
And the wine is just part of the dinner. And in fact, this is just part of the Sunday dinner. And the references that the book I was reading and the references I'm looking at are saying that, like, for a lot of these early church suppers that happen between Pentecost and Paul, that these are just church suppers that are happening. And what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians, which is our text, you have the Gospels interacting with the Last Supper, and then you have 1 Corinthians. And these are the two texts that we tend to look at when we're going to the table. And so when you have Paul referencing the Last Supper, or you have Paul referencing the Passover meal with Jesus, he may have been new in assigning this. The writer I was reading was saying that Paul may have been introducing something new to what had become a church pattern. And that what Jesus was doing, like that Last Supper moment, that Passover meal moment, that do this in remembrance of me as often as you do it, that may have been something that only happened once a year on Passover. And that the church weekly meal that was being done was something else. It was a church meal. It was an agape meal, or a love feast is what they were called. They would call these things. And this was a time of church gathering and connectedness. But Paul in 1 Corinthians, when he's addressing the disparity in those meals, the wealthy are bringing in all of this food and eating their fill on it, while the poor who are bringing in their own meager things are starving because they can't afford a good dinner. They're watching the wealthy eat in the same room and feast, and they're starving. And Paul's like, this is a mess. Why are you behaving this way? You're all one. Remember on the night that Jesus took the bread and broke it. And he said, so like, it's possible, according to this writer, that Paul is tying in two things that are actually similar but different. And that might have been in 1 Corinthians the thing that started the ball rolling on now the church being something that makes those two one and the same.
Okay.
So we may have lost, the writer is saying that we may have lost the agape feast and just made everything communion.
That's possible. Just let's throw some context in here, because you quoted a source that a lot of folks have no grasp on, called the Didache, right? Yeah. So there is two more theological terms, right? Yeah,
lots of bonuses.
Bonuses this week. So I mean, the first one is the word apocrypha, which a lot of folks have interacted with already.
Especially if you come from a Catholic background.
So you have the apocrypha, and the word apocrypha means books that are accepted by some as canonical. Mm-hmm. And there's actually an Old Testament.
So many terms in it once. Canonical. Canon. That's the 66 books of the Bible that are agreed.
Yeah, the word canon means they come up to a rule. They measure up,
a certain rule.
Right? Yeah. So we have 39 books in the Old Testament that are canon for Protestant believers. There are 8 additional books that are added in Roman Catholicism that are accepted by them as canon. Believe it or not, there's an additional shelf of books that are apocryphal to both the Roman Church and to the Protestant Church. Mm-hmm. They're still called apocrypha because some people accept them. Some people look at them and say, these books are, going back, holy, and they have power and authority. And there's actually a New Testament apocrypha that are books that are accepted by some as they should be part of the canon. Mm-hmm. And then there's another segment, which we call pseudepigrapha, which has nothing to do with hogs. Okay.
Right.
A pseudepigrapha.
It's like turkey bacon.
Yeah, right. Pseudepigrapha are books that no one accepts.
Right.
So there's an Old Testament pseudepigrapha, there is a New Testament pseudepigrapha, but that the fact that they're not accepted as
Biblical.
doesn't mean that they don't have value.
Right. So right. So think about this, right? Like, so you have, if you want to learn about ancient Greek culture, we can read our current history books that we all agree upon and study and say, like, this is authoritative. These are actual historians that were there or that can be verified. But you can also learn a lot about Greek culture by reading letters that people who were in the time were writing back and forth to each other.
Yes.
Right? That would, you would call that like first person resources, or like original resources kind of thing.
Yes.
Right? So they're not necessarily things that you would be able to map a whole study of thought in Greek culture around, but they're informative.
Yes.
Right? And so there are these pseudepigraphal works, many of which are happening contemporaneously. They're happening around the same time period that other things are happening.
Yes.
And no one at the time would call them biblical.
No one.
No one following calls them biblical. But they're interesting because they give you a picture into what culture is like.
Yes.
Right.
And some of them, are downright crazy. Right.
True.
So, for example, the guy that wrote the
Dan Brown. He's from New Hampshire. I just realized. I played in his golf course this summer.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he had like leased a portion of the land to like 3 holes. It's a gorgeous course. I would never be allowed on there.
Otherwise. Yeah. Because you're too vulgar.
I am.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh man, so good. All right.
So you take Dan Brown. Dan Brown's books are written with a focus on pseudepigrapha.
Mm-hmm.
There is a Gospel of Thomas that has been around for a millennium.
Mm-hmm.
No one ever accepted the Gospel of Thomas as authoritative or even genuine.
Right. Even in its day of writing.
Even in its day. It's kind of like the Gospel of Thomas was the equivalent of a Dan Brown novel in its day.
Right. Or it's like a Tim LaHaye book, right?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Like, Tim LaHaye books.
Yeah.
Definitely pseudepigrapha.
Yeah. Like there are these
people are now mad at me.
Yeah,
I do this at least once a series. So,
right? So like those, like those end times books, Left Behind, like those things. Like, so people will read those now and be like, this is
what's going to happen.
This is how it's going to end.
Yeah.
But when it was written, the person who wrote it knew, and the primary audience hopefully knows, right, that this is not how. Like, this is fiction,
right?
Based on what could happen based on our shared belief system.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we've just blown the bubbles of
some of you
listening.
Left Behind is not the Bible, guys.
Please.
Yeah.
Please, it's not.
There's stuff in there, but it's not the Bible. It's fiction.
So what many people see the value of those. Mm-hmm. Well, here's the awesome thing about the Didache.
Mm-hmm.
The Didache was most likely an early church manual.
Right.
Some of you are familiar with it. Maybe you're a pastor. I have a book in my library called the Star Book.
You can get like burnt coffee there?
So like the Star Book will tell me, it's kind of a manual for pastors that says, here's what you do at a funeral, and here's what you do at a wedding, and here are some sample service orders that you can follow for all kinds of different events.
Yeah, and like everybody from your generation was like, I'm going to pick that one that does 3 hymns, offering, and then a sermon.
Exactly. Yes. 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 So you define it. The Star Book helps define what is normal practice within a church, and on a regular basis, the Star Book was updated. There are others. There are other additional ones. The Star Book tends to be more toward. It's actually quite Anabaptist. It's actually very structured toward Mennonite congregations, which is interesting. There are others that they're just service manuals. This is what you do in this circumstance, and And the Didache is very similar to that. So what you have there is you have a resource that came out that said, here's how to handle a love feast. Here's how to handle. My favorite one statement in the Didache is that if an evangelist comes and he stays more than 3 days, he's a false prophet.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So therefore, that week of meetings that evangelist has wanted, false prophet. If he stays more than Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, kick him out.
He's not here for the
He's
gospel.
not here for the gospel. He's here for the money.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that Didache says 3 days. That's the max that you keep an evangelist. So, which I love.
Relatives and evangelists, they start to stink
After
after
3 days. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, but here's the thing. Here's one of the things about the Didache. I'm not convinced that it's universal in the church. So it's highly regional.
Yeah, that's fair. What's the region, though?
Most likely, it's the region of what would be the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire.
Okay.
It's more focused on what would be Turkey and maybe Greece. There are actually 4 regions to the church in the early days, and this is probably early church history. There are 4 regions. And those 4 regions actually demonstrate themselves even in Bible translation and Bible versions. So you have a region that centers on Turkey and the area that Paul was very focused on. You have a region focused on Caesarea. That would be Judea, Syria, as far east as, say, Babylon. And then you have a North African region, which is called the Alexandrian region, and that's kind of the most philosophical region. It comes out of Alexandria. Egypt is the center of that church, and it stretches all the way through Morocco and Casablanca.
Right. Some of our best manuscripts are from that region, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And then you have a Roman version or a Western European version, and that's basically Rome, Spain, southern France. You don't get much further north than that.
The Gauls make that tricky.
Yeah, exactly. So you have regionalization of the church, and I would say that the Didache is more in that Greek tent than some other things. And the Greek concept of communion is very different. Now, here's the other side of it. I don't think that the Didache precedes Paul. So Paul definitely precedes the Didache.
Well, it would make sense if he's doing these missionary journeys into that area to plant churches.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So 1 Corinthians predates the data that you're going to have in the Didache that would call this a love feast. It does not mean that they have not perhaps blossomed from 1 Corinthians 15 to say, okay, we're going to break bread in a love feast, and we're going to make it more common. And it doesn't preclude the reality that it may have already been the common practice of the Greek church,
right,
prior to Paul. We're celebrating Thanksgiving next week, but our brothers and sisters in Canada already did it October 12th, which is Columbus Day, I thought, but they celebrate Thanksgiving. It's that same concept. They have a different they're not celebrating the Pilgrims in Canada. They're celebrating something else. We are celebrating the Pilgrims. We have a different storyline, and we have a different focus, perhaps. But we're all going back to the same thing of Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
So there very well could be in the Greek church, and even in Paul's day, there could very well have been this development of
a separate celebration.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because there's no tie to Passover in that Gentile world.
Right. Right. So, which again goes to this other thing, I guess my question is what's coming first, and then eventually this question is where do we go with it? But you get this in Acts too. You have these frequent meal gatherings where they're breaking bread.
Yeah, Acts 2.
Acts talks about the breaking of bread together.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, the question is this I read this. I've always read this as, oh, they're frequently having communion, right? Are they're
But
frequently gathering to have the communion service? I think that's the I think that is the misinformed guess or reading my culture back into another culture.
yes,
And it is much more likely they're just eating together a lot.
yes,
And in the process of them always sharing these meals and always eating together, there are times in which they will remember the Lord's Supper, or they will
yes,
remember. And I bet, like, especially in these early days, every time they're getting together, they're thanking the Lord for the resurrection,
yes.
for his death, burial, and resurrection. Of course. Why wouldn't? Like, that's the whole reason that we're gathering together. But so out of that, you have this practice of just life. We're celebrating meals together, like the early Acts potluck supper. And every time we gather, the pastor or somebody, an elder, somebody will get up. They will thank the Lord for his death, burial, and resurrection. They will enjoy the meal together.
And they'll celebrate their
And
commonness.
they'll celebrate their commonness together. But then out of this comes this like defined practice of eating a cracker that sucks all the moisture from your head and drinking Welch's grape juice. And we can only do this on the first Sunday of the month.
But is that even the issue? Because here's the thing. If you come from an Eastern Orthodox background,
Yeah.
you don't eat matzah.
Right. You eat
You eat actual
loaf.
bread.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, if you're in the Roman church, you definitely put that little
weird wafer thing.
Oh man, what do they make that
And this,
out of?
yeah, again, this practice is all over the place. In
I
seminary,
thought that styrofoam was new.
in seminary, the seminary I went to had Presbyterian roots, but it was multi-faith cultural. I don't know. It's, guys from lots of, and ladies from lots of different backgrounds went to the same seminary. And we would have these retreats where we would do communion together. And sometimes they were those like ready to eat things that we've all become pretty familiar with over COVID.
CREs.
Yeah. And then the other times we would all like go up and like grab a hunk out of a loaf of bread, dip it in a chalice of red something, and then consume communion in that way. We would do it in these different patterns because different patterns exist.
Right.
Man, like growing up Baptist, and then and in this kind of world that we're in now, like it's the broken matzah and the Welch's, and we have to do it on the first Sunday of the month. And if we don't, something's kind of off. And we have this whole. I talked about this part in the sermon. We have this whole choreography, and every church has a choreography. And at some point, like if you mess up the choreography, like we did last Sunday, everybody notices it, and it feels weird. Man, how did you get like? Are these even the same thing? Like, are we doing something that's extra biblical in the name of trying to be biblical?
No, but here's the thing. So here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 that throws the door open to all of this stuff.
Yeah.
He says, "For as often as you eat this bread," and
This bread.
That's the thing, right? I have often. This is my focus. It's like, if they're talking about matzah,
Yeah.
then I should have communion once a year.
Right.
Because there's only 7 days in all of Israel's history that they actually eat this bread, which is dry, which is the unleavened bread of
It's not quite
Israel.
matzah either, right? It's like a flatbread kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. But if we were truly eating, if it's this bread, meaning matzah, then communion should be once a year. And yet we have gravitated, of course, to this place. And I think this comes out of the sacramentalism of the Roman Church, where if I'm going to assure myself of heaven, I need to have taken communion.
Yeah.
Because I need to reassure myself and God that we're together on this.
Yeah.
So in Romanism, you have folks.
Right. This is battlefield, right? Like
you have good Irish folks who are there every single morning
to take their
communion.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like these scenes, these battlefield scenes where the priest medic is walking through to the wounded soldiers, offering last rites and communion. Right? Like this is you're on your deathbed. Still, last rites are still a thing. You want to make sure that you are.
Man, but you know what?
Taking communion.
Somebody was telling me the other day. This is horrendous. Now look, I'm not sacramental. So My only sacrament is the blood of Jesus Christ shed on my behalf, singularly, once and for all.
Right.
And there is nothing. The word sacred is the thing that makes me holy.
Right.
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 So there is nothing that makes me holy.
We'll get
other
into imputed righteousness at some point here.
There you go. Yeah. The only thing that makes me holy is the shed blood of Jesus Christ, shed on the cross once for all and once for me. And there is nothing that I can do that will ever change my relationship with God. And there is nothing that I need to do to keep my relationship with God.
Right. So there is only one sacrament, and it's done by Jesus.
But I was recently talking to somebody.
Right?
Yeah, we have ordinances. I was recently talking to somebody who was telling me that they worked in a nursing home, and the priests did not want to come to do final unction, last rites for dying patients. They would come like once a month and do last rites for everybody that was in the nursing home. And then it was like, don't call me because I've already covered them all for this month.
That sounds like my friend. I had a friend in seminary jokingly who just said that like on January 1st every year, they prayed that God would bless all their meals and they wouldn't pray it anymore.
Yeah.
Covered all of them.
And she said she got to a point where she was calling priests and lying to them. She would say, well, this patient is new since you were here. Would you come and give them last rites? Because she knew these people were suffering with the reality that they might not make it to heaven because they weren't getting last rites.
Wow.
Let me just tell you this, having said that and having told this horrifying story of
Laziness.
What I see as laziness and people letting down on what they say that they believe. You don't need me to come and pray over you when you die. I am more than willing to do that. I'm going to come to you and I'm going to review with you what it means to know Jesus as your Savior.
Just talk about the only sacrament.
I'm going to talk to you about the only sacrament, and I'm going to confirm with you as best you can communicate it to me that you have made that decision. And then I'm going to pray with you and trust you to Jesus. But giving you communion when you die is not going to change that.
Mm-hmm.
And because taking communion doesn't change that.
Yeah.
So, and that's why that's the thing. It's like, do I have to have communion every week?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of folks who come to me and have come to us as an evangelical church, and they're like, I struggle with the fact that you don't do communion every week. And I understand that it's part of your history and it's part of your tradition, but it's also part of that ritual that may have actually lost its meaning and significance.
So is the once a month communion that evangelicals tend to practice a compromise from that?
I think so.
It's like a middle ground.
Sure.
Like we think that this is probably just a Passover deal.
Yeah.
But you're coming out of Catholicism, and so we're going to meet you somewhere.
Somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I know, for example, the Grace Brethren, which is a small sect in the Midwest, mostly Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
The Grace Brethren practice quarterly communion. Pretty cool because they follow the John 13 pattern, and they actually do foot washing as well at that service, and then they take communion. A lot of churches that I know of have moved communion out of their Sunday morning venue to a Sunday evening venue, because if you're coming to get some kind of ritual cleansing from sin, it's not going to do it. So they do it Sunday evenings so that you have to be dedicated enough to show up for that.
Yeah. The church that I served in first out of college would do this. And I think they were trying to tie in this concept of love feast to communion. And they would, so their pattern, which I actually really liked, I would implement this someday if it would work for our culture. But they would have once a month Sunday evening service that was for communion. There's a once a month communion service. Otherwise, they did not have a Sunday service. So this was a special thing. And at the communion service, there would be a time of like a combination prayer meeting and communion service sort of thing, where the pastor would do the Phil Donahue thing, which some of you are listening and have no idea who that is, and it's fine. But they'd walk around the room with a microphone, somebody would stand up and offer a praise report or a prayer request, and you'd always have that one guy who talked for 20 minutes, um, and then so you'd have this time of prayer, and then you would all go to the table together, and have communion, and then afterward, the church would intentionally break out into the community to have dinner.
Interesting.
Together.
I like that.
So
yeah.
there would be these meals, and they'd actually call them agape meals. Like, and I was working in student ministry in that church, and we would do that with our students. We'd actually like have these things, and we'd all the whole student ministry would go to a restaurant, and we would split kids up intentionally in different tables, so they would have to interact with kids they don't normally interact with. Just this whole thing, right? And there's actually a really cool rhythm. I like that it made communion something other and something special and something out of the, it's just a different element of rhythm to the way they did things. And I thought that was cool.
Now, just a different perspective on this. Guy Glass, good friend of mine, such a good friend that actually,
Uncle Guy.
Guy, yeah. So his church is in Miyaca City, Florida. Look it up. And every Sunday after church, they have dinner.
Mm.
The entire congregation. They have people that are cooking. Different people cook each week, and they're ready, and they eat dinner after every single worship service, except Communion Sunday. And Guy might listen and say, "No, we changed that," or
right?
Yeah, or you misunderstood that, right? But they don't on Communion Sunday. They celebrate the Lord's table, and then they go home. But there is a meal at that church every single week because their fellowship is important and significant to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are cool things. And I guess the point here is this, that we should be careful as Christians to not get so tied to our liturgy that we miss the point of the liturgy.
That is so true.
And I guess that was the emphasis of my sermon too, like, a side emphasis, because I think it's so important to think about the community part. Like, I think we're so individualistic. It's really easy to think like, how am I before Jesus? But I'm holding those elements in my hand, like that quiet time of prayer. But it's also really important to remember that this is community and communion have the same roots, right? Like, we need to think about how our standing is as a body and as a church family. It's really important to remember. But this other piece, like, we just tend to take things that are part of our rhythm for granted. And sometimes they become things that become, idolatrous to us.
All we're doing is just following a ritual.
Yeah. And in doing so, it's lost all of its power and is now something less than holy. And
it's common.
Our responsibility as people who love Jesus is to put these things under the microscope every once in a while and say, like, is this biblical, or have I made this an idol? And then is there a better way of actually reflecting the heart of what is going on here in Scripture? And it's worth thinking through and applying. Otherwise, we're just like, we're into the same thing that Pharisees run into with their worship of their temple, right? Like, we need to be careful in these areas to not become so tied to a rhythm or routine or a piece of our liturgical history that's lost its power.
We've done a good job this morning of coming full circle, don't you think? Talking about holiness, being separate, and then tying
without even planning it.
Yeah,
I love
good
this.
Theme Sunday, theme day. Yeah,
right. So there you go, friends. We're glad you joined us today. I hope that something about today maybe triggered something in your mind. Like, maybe there's some other like piece of church culture that needs to be examined or thought through. Send us a note, podcast@marshcorner.com, or send something on the Facebook page. Shoot us a text if you happen to know our number. But this whole thing is interesting to me, and I really think it's something I want to continue to wrestle with just personally. Like, what are we doing with this really important aspect of our faith, and are there ways that we can do this better? But for now, thanks for joining us. We hope that there's something helpful in that. Please share it with a friend if you found something that you liked. Don't forget to like the podcast. That really helps us out a lot, and we'll see you back here next week.